Hi everyone, it's Miss Seward, and today we are going to be learning about the carbon cycle, specifically carbon in the atmosphere and the sources and sinks, where it moves, how it gets there, and the whole process of how it cycles throughout our planet. Now, the objectives for today, our main learning objective is going to be explaining the steps and reservoir interactions in the carbon cycle. The knowledge that you're going to gain from these notes is just the movement of atoms in the carbon cycle, some of the reservoirs, and some of the sinks of carbon, how photosynthesis and cellular respiration are related to this, and then how fossil fuels are involved in this process of the carbon cycle. And the skill that you're going to practice at the end of this is going to be with visual representations. So explaining relationships between different characteristics of environmental concepts, processes, or models represented visually in theoretical contexts or in applied contexts. So an overview of the carbon cycle. Just to start out, the carbon cycle is the movement of molecules that contain carbon between sources and sinks. So when you think about these molecules, you can think of like carbon dioxide, glucose, methane, anything that has that C in the molecule. And this is going to be kind of an example of all the different steps of the carbon cycle and where things can go. Now, a carbon source is going to be a process that adds carbon to the atmosphere. So fossil fuel combustion, animal agriculture adds methane through the cow's actual burps and farts. Deforestation also releases carbon dioxide from cutting down the trees, but then it also takes away the ability for those trees to remove carbon in the future. So these are all going to be adding carbon to the atmosphere. If you look at our diagram here, think of these arrows going up. That's going to be that. A carbon sink is a carbon reservoir that stores more carbon than it releases. So we can look at the ocean here as an example of a carbon reservoir. The plants, the soil in the ocean. Now, a really important thing to remember is the fact that some steps of this happen really quickly, like combustion, versus some of them are very slow, like sedimentation and burial. So if we look at the ocean as an example here of sedimentation and burial, when you have the different organisms die, they move down to the bottom, they get compressed into the rock layer there, that's sedimentation. And then burial, they just keep getting pushed down. That takes so long. It's a very, very slow process. Eventually, it creates fossil fuels. Now, if you think about extraction, where we use technology to go and drill out that oil and combust it, that happens way faster. So when you're kind of thinking of the time scale and things that are adding more to the atmosphere versus taking it out, keep in mind the speed of how things are going. Now, the main kind of big idea of this is that when you can have an imbalance based on the reservoirs or the sinks and how carbon is being stored, if you're having a lot more stuff releasing it into the atmosphere than taking it out, that's where you lead to an imbalance. You're going to have way more carbon in the atmosphere. And basically, the atmosphere is going to be our major carbon reservoir. Increasing levels of carbon in the atmosphere can lead to global warming. So if you've heard about global warming and why driving cars might be involved in that, just think about the carbon that's being released into the atmosphere, and that some of the processes that take it out take way longer for that to happen, so we get an imbalance. Now, one of the main drivers in the exchange of carbon in this cycle is through photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So any organism that does photosynthesis, it's going to be plants, algae, and phytoplankton. And what photosynthesis does is it removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and converts it to glucose. So if you look at the equation here for photosynthesis, you've got carbon dioxide becoming glucose through this process. Or at least that's where the carbon's going in this. Now, glucose is a biological form of carbon, and it's stored chemical energy in the form of sugar. So carbon is stored in glucose there. So any organism that does photosynthesis, it's considered a carbon sink because carbon's going out of the atmosphere and then it's being put into a plant here that's holding on to that carbon and it's no longer in the atmosphere. So it's considered a sink because it's going into it. Then we have cellular respiration. This is done by plants and animals. And what occurs during this is it releases stored energy. So if you look at the equation here, it uses oxygen to break glucose down and release energy. So we start with glucose right here through the process. Now we've got carbon dioxide, which is going to be released into the atmosphere as it's being breathed out by this organism. And because carbon dioxide is going out into the atmosphere, it is considered a carbon source because it's putting it out. Now, one thing to keep in mind is the fact that both of these processes are happening very quickly. Throughout these slides, you just did cellular respiration quite a bit, and it's happening really fast. Now, actually, when we think about photosynthesis and cellular respiration, when it comes to the carbon cycle, actually what ends up happening with the carbon between the biosphere and the atmosphere, it ends up being a pretty balanced amount. There isn't really any net increase in the atmosphere because if you look at these two equations that are opposite each other, you end up having carbon dioxide being taken in and converted to glucose, glucose going out. So it's a process that's cycling these carbon atoms, but it's not really like adding more to or taking out. It just kind of keeps happening in a pretty quick process. Now, one of the big drivers of carbon is going to be the ocean and the atmosphere. So there's this process called direct exchange, and this is where carbon dioxide moves directly between the atmosphere and the ocean by dissolving into and out of ocean water. So if you've got carbon dioxide floating around in the atmosphere, it can just dissolve into the ocean, and then it can also dissolve out of the ocean at the surface of the water there. This also happens very quickly and generally in equal directions. So there's going to be a balancing level of carbon dioxide between the atmosphere and the ocean. Now, here's where that really matters. If we are having atmospheric carbon dioxide increase, that means that the ocean carbon dioxide is also increasing. And through this process, it leads to ocean acidification. So the ocean water is actually getting more acidic as it takes in more carbon dioxide. Now, you do have algae and phytoplankton doing photosynthesis. So they are taking carbon dioxide out of the ocean and the atmosphere through the process of photosynthesis. Additionally, coral reefs and marine organisms with shells, like crabs and clams and mussels, they also take carbon dioxide out of the ocean to create calcium carbonate exoskeletons. So those shells are made out of calcium carbonate. And in order to make calcium carbonate, carbon dioxide is involved in that process. So you do have the algae and the coral reefs able to take some of that carbon dioxide out. I mean, not necessarily at the rate that it's coming in with higher atmospheric CO2 levels, but that is a process in this. Now, also in the ocean, you have sedimentation, which I mentioned earlier, is when marine organisms die and their bodies sink to the ocean floor, and then those, their carcasses are then broken down into sediment. So sediment on the ocean floor that contains carbon. Then burial is the step after that, and this takes a long period of time. And this is where the pressure of the water is going to press that carbon-containing sediment from the dead marine organisms, and it's going to happen on the ocean floor where it's creating the sedimentary stone. Stones like these are going to be limestone or sandstone, and these are going to be long-term carbon reservoirs. They're going to be stuck there for quite a while. I mean, if you think about if you go to the coast and you can see some of the limestone type soil, the bluffs of it, those can stay around for millions of years. So burial is going to be a process where carbon is there typically for a while. Now we also have burial, extraction, and combustion involved. So like I said, burial is very slow. It stores carbon in underground sinks like sedimentary rock, but also fossil fuels. And this is just kind of a recap of the last slide where I covered the fact that it's compressed into that sedimentary rock from pressure from the ocean. So it's just really compact and it's pressing it down. And this creates rock, but it also creates fossil fuels. Now, fossil fuels, you may have heard this term, but specifically what we're referencing is going to be coal, oil, and natural gases. And these are formed from fossilized remains of organisms. Oftentimes, past dead matter, like dead ferns, often make coal, or marine algae and plankton end up making oil a lot of times. So if we look at this over here, you're kind of seeing that process of sediments and burial, and over time you get some of this oil and gas, and then we get through the process of pulling it out for fossil fuels. And this is called extraction and combustion. So the extraction is going to be the digging up of the fossil fuels, and then combustion is going to be burning them as energy sources, and this releases carbon dioxide. So combustion is what's happening here, like in the car. And then extraction is the part here where it's being pulled up and out. And when we talk about this kind of imbalance, you need to remember that burial and formation of fossil fuels takes way longer than extraction and combustion. So this is why we're seeing an increase in concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, because these processes are happening super fast where we're combusting it. You have more and more cars, you have more and more oil being dug up, and it's being released carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And then you think of the really slow process to get it into the ocean, to get it into decaying matter, to get it into the sediment, to be buried, to become, that's going to take millions of years. And we are using up the fossil fuels at a much faster rate. So we're adding more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere than is being taken in. Now here's going to be your practice FRQ question for today. And what I want you to do is to look at this diagram right here and identify one process in the diagram that happens quickly and one process that happens slowly. And I also want you to explain how the rate at which fossil fuels are transferred into the atmosphere, as shown in this diagram, has altered the carbon cycle during the past 250 years. So those are going to be what I want you to do for your practice FRQ. And hopefully these notes were helpful in covering the topic of the carbon cycle.